Hey everyone, this is Mrs. Wortley. Um, going to teach you a lesson about evolution here. I hope you enjoyed that video about that cute science couple that researched the beaks of finches on the Galapagos Islands. So we'll talk a little bit about that in today's lesson. This is the picture I usually show my students when I start our evolution unit. And I always ask them to identify one change you see in the skulls from A to N. And the top skulls are a front view and the side are the profile views. And I got a lot of different answers like um, the mouth part is less protruding at N when compared to A. The eye sockets get smaller. The forehead seems to get larger. The brow bone is also a little less protruding. You can see that here it's sticking out less than it is as if when you go back and look at the skulls. So, and at the end of this type 1, I usually mention that these are changes that happen over time. And that's really the definition of evolution. It means change over time. Now, evolution actually happens through a process called natural selection. And as the name suggests, nature or the environment is very much involved. But before we get into that, I just want to give you a very, very brief history of the theory of natural selection. And it begins with this. No, that's not Santa Claus or Aristotle. So I get that a lot too when I ask this question. But this is the father of evolution known as Charles Darwin. And he was not the only person who thought of this theory, but he is the first to put it down on print. And it started when he took a trip on the HMS Beagle for 5 years, and they traveled around the world. Okay, and they started in England, made their way down to South America. This is where he made a stop in Galapagos Islands and observed those finch species, went all the way around, saw some interesting animals in Australia, India, and Madagascar, and then made his way up, and he started to put his ideas together. And through his observations, he noticed a few things. He noticed that many species that lived in different areas of the world showed similarities, even though they lived very far apart. Just like these birds are similar, but what varies is their beak size. And he realized that it meant that they shared a common ancestor and that these traits that they had gave them some kind of advantage in living in the area that they were found. So let's define what natural selection is, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. So natural selection is the process by which organisms evolve. And organisms that are best adapted to their environment survive, reproduce, and pass on their traits. So this is a process that results in change over time in species. And this change can happen over a long period of time, like in human evolution, or it can happen very quickly, as in bacteria. And when we talked about antibiotic resistance, that's evolution that happens at a fast pace, also happens in insects. And this natural selection accounts for all the diversity you see on life. This is why we see organisms with so many different traits. Okay. And how does natural selection work? So here's an easy example. You have a population of beetles that lives in a given area, and these are the predators of those beetles. These birds are eating them. And for some reason, they prefer the green color. Okay. Now you'll notice that there's some variation or differences in their traits. Some are green and some are orange. Okay. Now, over time, if this continues, what will happen is if the birds are picking off the green beetles, then there'll be less competition. So these beetles are all competing for the same resources. They're competing for food, for mates, for space, for oxygen. And if the green ones are getting picked off, then the orange ones will have a better chance of survival. So you're going to start to see their numbers increase. Okay. Now, by the last generation, there are no green beetles left and only orange beetles. So the green beetles have been selected against. That means that the environment basically played a role in deciding who was surviving. Okay. Now, one thing I want you to understand is that the orange beetles here are a product of reproduction, okay, and the passing on of this trait. It's not that the green beetles turned into orange beetles. So that's a misconception in evolution, that if you need a trait to survive, you can kind of just get it or get used to the environment. And that's really not what an adaptation is. Okay, an adaptation is a trait that you're born with. And some traits are helpful and some are not. And being a green beetle was not a helpful trait. So that's why you don't see any green beetles in the last generation. All right. So natural selection, in order for it to happen, you need a few conditions. And one of the conditions is known as overproduction. And just like the word suggests, over meaning more, okay, and production meaning to produce, means that a species has the potential to produce more offspring than can possibly survive. So these are some kind of insect eggs, and these are poppies, and not all of these are going to survive. Eggs, the reason why insects have many, many eggs, hundreds and sometimes thousands, is that they don't all survive. They get eaten, they die, they dry out. Same with poppies. All these flowers are not going to survive. Only some will. The next, well, this is also overproduction. Cats have many litters, and not all of them all survive. As then the same goes for the ducklings. What limits population? So just like we mentioned before, there are things in the environment that keep populations from growing out of control. So, for instance, predators. Predators hunt many organisms, and that keeps populations down. Competition. Competition is one of the biggest factors that actually limits a population. So, animals are, excuse me, animals are competing for mates, for food, for space. Disease will limit a population. Sometimes this happens to plants. There's a fungus that can affect the plant population, and the population can die. Or even climate change, and we see this happening now. Lots of animals are becoming extinct because they cannot adapt to the changing environment. And this is one classic example of this, where polar bears, they survive by swimming from ice floe to ice floe, and there's fewer and fewer of these ice floes, so they have to swim faster, and some of them are drowning. So what else do you need for natural selection? You definitely need variation in a population. So variation are those differences in traits. And through sexual reproduction, you get a unique combination of traits or genes that you inherit from your parents. So we discussed in the last unit how you get variation. Meiosis and fertilization are the two main causes of variation. In meiosis, you get random chromosomes when the cell is dividing to make sperm and egg. Which chromosomes end up in which egg and which sperm is completely random. And fertilization, you have DNA from two different individuals combining to produce an offspring. There's definitely more variation there. That's why you don't look like any of your parents. You're a combination of them as opposed to being a clone. So, and of course, mutations. Mutations, like we mentioned, are in the last unit, are random changes in your DNA. So, if that random change produces a new trait that can be helpful to your survival, that might be an adaptation. Okay, so that's just showing you the mutation there. And this over here is showing you an event in meiosis that shuffles around more genes. It's called crossing over. So just to show you an example of variation in the beetle population, there are 83,000 different species of just the snout beetle. This is one particular type of beetle. So lots of variation in this population. Okay, you can see variation in shell color and beetle shell pattern and frog pattern, frog camouflage pattern. So all organisms show variation, at least those produced through sexual reproduction. Now, why is this so important? So meiosis and mutations can produce new traits that increase an organism's chances of survival. Any trait that increases survival is known as an adaptation. So, one thing to understand is that not every trait is an adaptation. But if it's not an adaptation, what will happen is you'll see that trait less and less in each generation because it'll decrease survival. Only those traits that have allowed survival are going to be seen in the next generation, and that's why you call those adaptations. So here's an example of an adaptation that's helpful in one environment and not in the other. So being a white-peppered moth was helpful in this environment because the trees were all white. And you have two types of moths here, the black and the white pepper. And the black ones were easily seen by the birds, so they were picked off. Now, after the Industrial Revolution, what happens is all the bark of the trees started to become dark. And so the white-peppered moth, what was a trait once before, an adaptation, is no longer an adaptation in this new environment because it is more easily seen by birds, and these were being picked off and eaten more easily. And now being a black moth was a more helpful trait. So if the environment is changing, just remember an adaptation, its usefulness can also change as well. So being a white-peppered moth here was advantageous, but not in this new environment. These are just a couple of cool pictures of adaptations. You can see how having that skin pattern is helpful in camouflaging. Insects that look more like leaves obviously are able to better survive being eaten by birds and other predators. This is an interesting one. So you can see this moth has a specific pattern of these circles, and the moths that have ones that look the most like owl eyes increase their chances of survival because birds are afraid of owls. And so when they fly near them, they won't eat this moth because it fears that it's an owl. So the moth is not deciding on its own pattern, wing pattern or color, or it doesn't really have a say in this trait at all. It's just a random change that happens. And those moths that have patterns that look more like owl eyes will survive. Those that don't get eaten off. So you should see this being passed on to the next generation. Termites have the ability to, they have an interesting trait. They're one of the few organisms that can break down wood. So there's less competition for food there. These are, I forget the name of these. They're like a type of deer in Africa where they basically jump, instead of running away from predators, they're able to jump very high. And the higher they jump, the more they're able to say to their predators, oh, don't bother with me. You won't be able to catch me. So this is an adaptation that increases its survival. And last but not least, the last condition that you need for natural selection is environmental change. So this is the driving force for evolutionary change. Changes in the environment act on traits and determine which traits will be beneficial for survival or adaptations. What you'll find is if the environment isn't changing very much, then there is no push for those animals to have to adapt. So you're going to see very few changes in organisms that live in environments that change little. So the ocean, if you look at sharks, they've changed very little from millions of years ago. The horseshoe crab is another example of an organism that pretty much looks the same, and it dates back, if you look at fossils from 400 million years ago, those horseshoe crabs look the same. So they haven't, they've had the same traits because their environment hasn't changed very much and it hasn't driven evolution. But most animals that live on land, you'll see they look dramatically different from their ancestors. Like the horse looks very different from its ancestor. It was actually looked like a small dog because the environment on land has changed dramatically. So inheritance of adaptation. So this is an important part. The organisms best adapted to the environment will survive, reproduce, and pass on their traits to their offspring. And this is how you get those new traits and changes in populations. the adaptive trait will become more common in a population, or the word that's used is increase in frequency. Okay, a couple more things. When a trait has an adaptive value, it's a measure of how helpful that trait is for an organism's survival. So, having thick fur or even white fur in a polar bear has high adaptive value because it allows it to blend in and keep it warm. So, you should see this trait increase in frequency or how often it occurs because it increases survival. Okay. And finally, if you don't have any traits that allow you to survive, then you will see species become extinct. Okay, so extinction occurs when a species cannot survive to the changes in the environment and it has no adaptations. And the majority of organisms that have ever lived on Earth are extinct and are continuing to become extinct because the environment is changing so much. Okay, let's summarize. Some organisms have traits or adaptations that help them survive in their environment. Organisms that survive, reproduce, and pass on their traits, adaptations to their offspring. Adaptive traits become more common in the species population. Traits that don't help survival become less common. So here's an interesting picture of some organisms that have a couple of the conditions that we mentioned. So first of all, you see overpopulation. So not all of these organisms will survive. Overproduction, I mean. You should see that there's variation in their height, in their color, and their size. Okay. There's competition. They're competing for food, and food seems to be limited. And let me just move on to this one. Environmental change. Perhaps this fruit was more available and say they were all able to survive, but now that the food is much higher, um, maybe only the larger trees are around in this environment. You'll see that only the larger um, organisms here are able to get food. So anyone that doesn't have that tall trait, you'll see them die out. So that's why you see these guys on the floor here with X's on their eyes. And what will happen is in the next generation, this trait will be passed on. So you'll see this trait become more common in this population. Now, can that change? Yes. If there's an environmental change that allows this food to be more accessible, you'll see those traits change in the population. All right. I'd like you to review this PowerPoint before you answer the questions on castle learning, and they'll all be about natural selection. Good luck.